and thanks for coming to my talk today. I'm going to be sharing with you guys some results from a little bit of exploratory research I've been doing over the past couple of years on a very unusual but a very rewarding subject. We've been looking at xylotheques from early Meiji Japan, this set of wood blocks that you see here. Now, many of you are probably wondering to begin with, what is a xylotheque? Well, wood and the unique properties of wood drove a lot of the early colonial expansion in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And often these missions resulted in large collections of wood samples being returned and stored in botanical institutions, sort of in the style of herbarium specimens, and documented and labeled as such. Later on, these became employed as teaching tools, especially in Germany, and different clever forms of representation were used, such as these xylotheques, which were disguised as boards, each containing features of the plant that they were portraying, along with a description of its different botanical attributes. However, very few of these collections are known to exist outside of Europe, or Germany in particular. The collection that I'm presenting on is actually a Japanese-made set of xylotheques. So, to give you an overview of these boards, each one is about 13 inches by 7 inches long, and it's made out of the wood of an economically important species. Most of them are native to Japan, and it's depicted with illustrations of the features of that plant. They're painted in a characteristically Japanese style, but also displaying more Western botanical elements portraying the different features of the plant. Furthermore, they're bordered by the bark of the tree and cornered by a cross-section of one of the branches. In the lower end of the panel, you have a label that gives the name both in Latin as well as Kaiji and katakana symbols. So you have here a complete unit depicting all of the features you need to identify one of these important tree species. So the construction of these boards is particularly clever by using a series of notches and both pegs and later metal nails. These were assembled all very uniformly. Prior to this research began, we knew of 2 existing collections of these woods, totaling about 178 specimens. These existed in Berlin at the Dahlem Botanical Museum, as well as in the Economic Botany collection. And what we knew from earlier works was that they were created in about 1878 by a botanical illustrator at the Koishikawa Botanical Garden named Chikusai Kato. We learned that from an interpretation of his artistic stamp, which was printed on the backs of every boards. We also knew that some of these boards could be attributed to earlier botanical illustrations, such as those by some of the illustrators that Siebold used when he was creating his Flora Japonica. The time period in which these boards were created was one of immense change in Japan. This was during a period known as the Meiji, or period of enlightened rule, where Japan had, after centuries of self-imposed isolation, opened up its borders to Western influence once again. In this transition from the state of feudalism, it was also going through massive educational reforms, including the opening of many new universities. At this time, Western scholars were invited and solicited to join the teaching staff as well as advise the development of these new programs. So while the influences of the board seem very distinctly European or Germanic, there are also indigenous Japanese prototypes and models that need to be looked at as well. One of the very first to be considered was created 80 years before these boards, in 1799, by a figure who was perhaps one of the earliest, if not the first, Japanese ethnobotanists. Mogami Tokunai was a very interesting and ambitious character who, while working for the Forest Service as a member of the shogunate, proceeded to document and transcribe the language of the Ainu people, which he already recognized was coming under threat of cultural loss and erosion. He played an enormous influence on Philipp Franz von Siebold, who was one of the few Westerners prior to the opening of Japanese borders to have access to Japan from his work on the island of Deshima in the Nagasaki harbor, where he was employed as a physician. So Tokunai had created a set of hundreds of these boards of economically important species on which he had painted in beautiful Japanese brushstrokes details of their leaves. No doubt, Siebold was very taken by these when he encountered Tokunai on their journey to the capital city, and they were given to him. So back on the island of Deshima, he was teaching Western principles of plant science to a number of students, as well as medicine. One of the pupils that he encountered in this time was Koishikawa Ito, and Ito was also very heavily influenced by his time with Siebold. Siebold had given him a copy of Thunberg's Flora Japonica, which he proceeded to transcribe from Latin into Kaiji and Katakana to bring this system of nomenclature into use in Japan. Later on, Ito went on to become one of the earliest directors of the Koishikawa Botanical Gardens as part of the university, and it was under his directorship that Chikusai Kato, this artist, was employed and created these boards. The same year of their creation, an archaeologist, Edward Sylvester Morse from Harvard, had come to teach about evolution and was very taken by the boards as well. So at the advent of this work, we were circulating a picture of a ginkgo board that was related to another project that was underway, and it caught the attention of a colleague in Japan at the Koishikawa Botanical Garden, who recognized this illustration from a postcard that the Friends of the Society had just released. Through inquiries with directors there, we learned that there was not only another set of these xylotheque prints at the Koishikawa Botanical Garden, but that there were also others in storage in the Harvard University Herbarium, as well as in a private collection in London. So we went from knowing about 2 of these sets to knowing about 5, containing in total 220 boards comprised of 150 different species and 70 duplicates. So on this premise, I'll summarize the collections for you. At Koishikawa, they were rediscovered in 2010 in these tea crates where they were stored to preserve against humidity and wrapped in newspaper, still contained from 1964. There are 25 in total. The museum associated with the Berlin Dahlem Botanical Garden has the largest known collection, and these were found or rediscovered in 1980 by the then director when he opens up these 2 mysterious cabinets in the corner of the herbarium in the one wing to have escaped bombing during World War II. And lo and behold, pulling open a drawer finds these boards arranged 4 to a drawer in a specially designed German-made cabinet. In total, there's 152 boards in this collection, and based on the records of the museum, we know that they were acquired in 1912 by a naval physician, Paul Kubler. The Q set is particularly mysterious, given the great detail that Q takes to document and inventory all of their accessions. The director's correspondences are meticulous and endless, and yet there's no record of the acquisition of these boards. We do know, however, that they likely arrived sometime before the war, and that they were on display somewhere because they were in a very polluted condition before restoration. There are 26 in total, and they were recently written about in Q Magazine. So finally, there's another set in London that was purchased at an auction by a private collector. Now these probably originated somewhere in Germany after they left Japan, that is. And this wasn't the first time they were purchased because of the presence of this old Japanese price tag that was on the back of one of the boards. And this gives the price at about 14 yen 40 cents, which at the time would have been, I think about $1,400, so it was pretty substantial even for then. So finally, there's one more set of boards at Harvard University Herbarium, 6 boards, and they're attributed to Edward Sylvester Morse, the same figure who was teaching at the university at the time. Now in the records, they had written that they were acquired in 1966. But they also came with these signs like they had been on display, but nobody knew where they'd come from. So I'd like to return to last year's wonderful Richard Evans Schulte Symposium, and the message of that was that he had played a role in so many projects, and this was no different. He continues to exert his influence, and in this case, I have to thank him personally for drawing our attention via blow dart to something we otherwise would have missed, which was this black and white photograph of a display case behind the glass flower collection, which shows us that in fact these boards had been in the museum since 1931, which is 30 years prior than the records had indicated. So even where records do exist regarding these boards, in some cases, they're incorrect. In total, 5 collections in Massachusetts, the UK, Germany, and Koishikawa. And they represent a number of different economic uses and culturally important species. For instance, for those of you at Karen's paper workshop yesterday, you will have already become familiar with Brucinetia peperifera, which is Kozoa, the paper mulberry. The Japanese lacquer tree doesn't want to show the nice picture I had of little lacquered bowls, but you can imagine they're very lovely. And finally, a lot of them also treat medicinal, fruits, ornamental, and other plants of spiritual, cultural, economic importance. So with all of this new information on the boards, we were curious to know what was their use and intended purpose. We went through the trouble to create all of these. Why and how did they leave Japan and end up in the present collections? And time's up?
How much? You can keep going.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll rush through it. So
You've got 3 minutes.
3 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So anyways, in the historical records, we found from Morse's own diary that they were intended as teaching aids for teaching botany. And we also found from diary records of the director in the same year information about their commission, which was from the university president. Now we looked at links between similar boards of the same species and noticed that there were 2 different types, some that were identical and some that were based on different material. So looking at these, some appeared to be based on other artwork, while others looked like they were based on live material. On a trip to the library in Koishikawa, we also found prototypes for some of these boards that were in unpublished sketches by the same illustrator. So there's an interesting lineage to these illustrations. We then tried to sort them by label type. As you can see, there's 4 primary labels and some secondary types that are distinguished by the presence or absence of the artist's stamp. So based on this, Berlin has the most disparate collection, or diverse in terms of labels, while others, such as the one at Koishikawa and Kew, both have all boards of one single label type. So this provides us information as to when the collections were dispersed and reassembled and what their relationship might be to one another. You have autonomous collections like the ones at Koishikawa and Kew, which have pretty much remained intact. And then you have these lumped collections, such as those in Berlin, as well as these little satellite offshoots, like the smaller collections at Harvard. So in conclusion, there's some broader conclusions to be drawn from this analysis. First of all, returning to the teaching theme yesterday, this is a wonderful example of some cross-cultural innovations and combinations of both art and science used in the practice of teaching botany that are still very intriguing and relevant today. They also illustrate the importance of taking a holistic framework and considering disparate and fragmented collections. Any of these collections considered in isolation wouldn't have been informative about their origins. And finally, the importance of developing and maintaining standards in economic botany collections and curation, which fortunately has been the topic of an ongoing working group here, and a publication is forthcoming on developing standards for curating cultural collections such as these. So we're still on the lookout for more boards, and I'd like to thank all of my collaborators, and thank you as well for listening.
I've got one quick question while Lisa gets set up.